Hi. First of all, I wanted to express my sincere gratitude to Melissa and Amanda and Anne and the whole Siebert gang. You guys do such meaningful work for young adults with traumatic brain injury, and I have been so thrilled to be a part of the meaningful work that you all do. And besides that, you're such wonderful people all around that I miss dearly since leaving Eugene, Oregon to move out to Pennsylvania earlier this year. And thank you for the introduction. My name is Laurie Gutmann Kahn. I'm an assistant professor of education at Moravian College, focusing mostly on special education. I focus my research, teaching, practice on issues of disability studies and education, transition for students with disabilities, including career development, and cultural understanding of disability within school contexts. I love working with teachers and vocational rehabilitation providers and other related service providers to meet the needs of young adults with disabilities in ways that explicitly support the human rights and self-worth of the individuals that we're working with every day. So I'm hoping that this presentation, this webinar that explores career advancement, where we're going to explore barriers and strategies for young adults with traumatic brain injury and other disabilities, will get at the heart of that issue of really understanding the social and environmental barriers that our students face. So, just a little heads up too, is when I talk about young adults and individuals with traumatic brain injury, I am sort of a teacher in my heart, so I often will refer to them as students. And I know in other capacities they might not necessarily be students, but that's just me being explicit with the hat that I sort of wear the most, as the teacher hat. So you'll have to excuse me. So in this webinar, we're going to be looking at sort of a collection of research on young adults with traumatic brain injury, as well as other disabilities during the early career years. And when I say early career years, I'm speaking from the approximately 18 to 26-year-old spectrum, both the outcomes, the barriers, as well as various positive strategies that are recommended for career advancement for young adults with traumatic brain injury and other disabilities during these years. This information was developed through an extensive exploration of research from the past approximately 20 years from a variety of fields, including education, career development, counseling psychology, human resources, special education, and vocational rehabilitation. So mostly in the social sciences. Lastly, I want to, at the end of this webinar, we're going to share 2 tools that have been hopefully emailed to you ahead of time that you can directly use in a career development environment that supports the career advancement for young people with disabilities and traumatic brain injury that was sort of developed out of this research. So I just want to be clear, when I'm talking about career development, I'm speaking to that lifelong process that everybody goes through, where we sort of manage learning and work so that way we can meet our own desired outcomes and employment. So that includes things like training and education, as well as support, and sometimes, making mistakes and learning from those and developing our vocational goals and our skills and abilities. And when I'm speaking about career advancement, it's kind of one of the most important elements for employee satisfaction because it's the idea that we're moving forward on the job, right? That we're learning new things, we're gaining new skills, we're getting raises, moving up in a career field. So the idea of career advancement, the main idea behind it, is that we're not staying stagnant in a low wage, low skilled, low valued position. That's not where we want to be. And I totally understand that it does differ for everybody. I know plenty of people who have a job that's sort of low skilled or low wage, and they're very satisfied with it. So in that case, career advancement isn't necessarily something that is applicable, but it's important for us to recognize that this should be something that is accessible for all individuals, regardless of disability, if that's something that you want. So a quick note before moving forward is we're going to be approaching this research from a social model of disability framework that examines the social construction elements of disability from a strength-based framework. And what I mean by that is we're going to be avoiding the deficit-based framework that positions that individual with a disability as sort of the cause for the barriers. We are going to be looking at things like functional limitations and accommodations, but we're not going to sort of like harbor or we're not going to focus all of our research on that. We're going to look at like environmental and social factors and barriers for young adults with traumatic brain injury and other disabilities. And at the end, hopefully we'll have time for question and answers. So when we were thinking initially about this idea about like, why is this age group, around from 18 to 26, important when we're thinking about career development for young adults with disabilities and with traumatic brain injury. And we know from past research that really makes the case for focusing on this, this stage of early adulthood, because it can have a significant impact on the individual's future career trajectory, as well as the overall sort of self-worth and happiness of the individuals themselves. So things like creating opportunities for employment, training, and education during this time is important for like that time period, right? Are they happy in where they are and in that time and space? But more so, by creating these opportunities for employment, training, and education during this time can establish a larger foundation for adult outcomes and occupational achievement across their lifespan. So without carefully planning for these sort of supports, individuals might be tracked into low-paying or unsatisfying jobs that they don't have any sort of way to navigate beyond. And this includes things like having a lack of opportunities for advancement, lack of motivation for advancement, but also a lack of knowledge for advancement. And finally, we know that gainful employment, specifically for people who experience traumatic brain injury, can have an increased positive influence on the outcomes, like employment outcomes, but also on things like the overall life satisfaction, for individuals who experience TBI. So importantly, young adults with traumatic brain injury and other disabilities are at a higher risk than their non-disabled peers for being unemployed, underemployed, and living well below the poverty line. And this, as you can imagine, can have significant effects on the overall health and life satisfaction for young adults as they transition into adulthood. And so these sort of potential negative outcomes are things that we really need to focus on, because one of the main roles that we have in the helping professions is to make sure that individuals can overcome these barriers and be able to lead successful, independent, and happy lives, and self-determined lives. And so by understanding the larger systems that they're up against, I think can really make a much larger difference. So now that we can sort of see the big picture of why focusing on career development is important for young adults with disabilities, we can also take a closer look at the causes of these outcomes and those barriers that exist for young adults with disabilities. Again, this is interdisciplinary research that explores sort of the social and environmental factors that can lead to barriers in career advancement. We'll discuss the functional limitations and accommodations briefly later in the webinar. But what we do know is that the social and environmental barriers to career advancement for young adults with traumatic brain injury include things like a lack of career experiences and job exploration that lead to things like limited aspirations. We'll explore early patterns of employment. We'll talk about lack of access to ongoing training and higher education, and discrimination and prejudice in the workforce. And I like this picture of the young man in the pizza costume, because it's one of those jobs that I would describe as, being low paying, low valued, and low skilled. Although there might be opportunities for advancement within like the company of, I think that might be Papa John's or something. But that would take some sort of planning to figure out how that would work. So the first barrier that we're going to explore is the limited early career explorations. So previous studies have found that high school students and young adults with disabilities, they're less likely than their non-disabled peers to be placed into structured work experiences to structured work experience or hold part-time jobs while they are still in K-12 setting. So these experiences have been highly correlated with higher incomes and wages, more stable employment throughout their lives, likelihood of receiving benefits such as healthcare, paid time off, stuff like that, and more full-time work. Without these experiences, and the experiences such as like job shadowing, mentorships, school-based businesses, and work-based internships, students with disabilities have limited knowledge of potential job opportunities and career paths. They have constrained high school work experience. They also might, constrained high school work experience also might be really salient for young adults with traumatic brain injury who have limited exposure to a range of employment opportunities and lowered expectations. And they often transition into like low wage, low skill jobs with no benefits and few opportunities for advancements. The second barrier that I'd like to talk about is limited aspirations. So career options also may be limited by lack of self-confidence and restricted occupation, occupational aspirations. Research has found that occupational aspirations for youth with disabilities are influenced by a number of different variables, including things like peer groups and parental and teacher expectations, academic skills, and the realities of the larger labor market. So in general, young people with disabilities feel less confident and less optimistic about the future than their non-disabled peers. And these low aspirations may be a realistic appraisal of skills and abilities, or it might mean that youth have prematurely or unnecessarily limited their own future possibilities. Occupational aspirations are also really stable during adolescence and serve as an important predictor of later aspirations in life, as well as future career choices. So decisions in this time period in emerging adulthood kind of set the stage for adult career trajectories. So I'd like you to just take a second, and I want you to think about whether or not, in your own work and your own practice, do you see an overall lack of self-confidence when you're discussing vocational goals? What do you do to sort of increase the self-confidence? And on the flip side of that, also maybe think about, maybe sometimes do you have individuals who sort of have an over expectation, and then how do you negotiate that as well? So I'd like you to just take a second and think about what your own experiences are concerning confidence and vocational goals for the individuals that you work with. So the next barrier that I'd like to explore are early patterns of employment. And so what I mean by this is what are the experiences what is the student's or the individual's first job experience? What are their first sort of exposure to employment environments? So a number of previous studies have documented the importance of the first job after high school in supporting the ongoing process of career development for young adults with disabilities. Entering the workforce directly after completing high school, it's a critical element in predicting future employment, meaning that students who take time off in between high school and their first job tend to have more difficulty with things like employment stability and enhancing opportunity for later career advancement. So this initial foray into the workforce, it often sets the stage for a career of lifelong earning and working capabilities. But unfortunately, many young adults with traumatic brain injury are either not competitively employed after leaving high school or transition from high school into entry-level and really unskilled positions. Young adults with disabilities also may have difficulty maintaining stable employment over time. And we often find low percentages of individuals are in part-time positions that they don't maintain over time. Young adults often can drift in and out of the workforce, changing jobs on a regular basis, not long enough in a job to achieve any sort of advancement or improve in work life or any type of standard of living. So they're just kind of, floating from job to job. Ongoing career advancement was influenced by a combination of factors that can be really important, including like early community-based work experiences and the ability to maintain stable employment over time. So young adults with disabilities must be able to sort of adjust to work demands in order to sustain and advance employment. And this requires not just occupational skills, but also the really difficult skill of adapting to on-the-job barriers and changes. So despite the amount of time and energy, that we spent working with students to imagine and gather information and analyze job tasks and choosing and obtaining and achieving an occupation, the reality of the workplace may require unforeseen adaptations. So like surprises in the workplace that can be problematic for people with disabilities and traumatic brain injury. The individual must have a carefully developed plan for disability management that takes into consideration such issues as transportation surprises, time management issues, even medication management, and sort of those physical, cognitive, and emotional endurance skills. The next barrier that I'd like to look at is the idea of lack of access to ongoing training. Another important aspect of development for early career workers is the ability to access ongoing training and support to gain skills and advance on the job. However, people with traumatic brain injury might not always be offered challenging job assignments or on-the-job training options that would enable them to progress to higher paying positions. So young adults with disabilities also may not have access to experienced mentors who could provide exposure to key opportunities and tangible support. Maybe another individual who has experienced a traumatic brain injury and can share their own personal experiences. Previous studies have described these having lack of mentors and role models in the workplace, even for well-established and highly successful adults with disabilities. The next barrier that I'd like to talk about is lack of access to higher education. And this aligns with the lack of access to on-the-job training. So in addition to lower enrollment rates for students with disabilities, they're also less likely to complete a program of study than their peers without disabilities. So without any sort of further training or higher education, young adults with disabilities may find that their career options are restricted to low-wage service occupations such as janitorial, retail, or food services, which don't necessarily allow for as much career advancement. Sorry, I got a little trigger happy there. The next barrier that I'd like to talk with you about, and this is the last barrier actually that we're going to explore, is the idea of, is discrimination and prejudice in the workplace. So employers may hold misconceptions, misinformation, or stereotyped assumptions about individuals with disabilities, which can severely impact initial access to employment, as well as opportunities for things like training and promotion. So about 43% of adults with disabilities have encountered job discrimination in the field related specifically to their disability. And individuals with traumatic brain injury are included in that as well. So employer misconceptions, misinformation, and stereotyped beliefs can create sort of invisible barriers to employment that really negatively affect people with traumatic brain injury and other disabilities. So this includes things like affecting the decision of who, discrimination can be manifested in such ways as affecting the decision of who employers fire and who they hire, as well as overall limit opportunities for things like training, who gets promoted. Also, a lot of the time this manifests in things like failing to provide reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities, as well as that other end of the spectrum, so direct and explicit intimidation and harassment. These barriers might be especially pronounced for women and people of color who experience the combined impact and the intersectional impact of membership in multiple marginalized groups. So that's something that's really important to consider as well. So we're going to move on from these barriers, and we're going to explicitly talk about some strategies that we can use to help individuals with traumatic brain injury to overcome these barriers. So now that we have an idea of what barriers young adults with disabilities in general face during emerging adulthood, I wanted to share with you some of the characteristics and skills that are associated with positive trajectories for employees with disabilities and traumatic brain injuries. Several studies have examined the unique qualities of highly successful adults with disabilities who have entered professional occupations with high opportunities for advancement. So fields like education, law, medicine, and government. One consistent feature across all of these individuals is the ability to persist in difficult situations and maintain a sense of personal control. Control implies both adjusting to internal perceptions and making, conscious decisions to adapt to the environment as needed, like those surprises that we were talking about earlier. In addition, many of these independent working adults with disabilities also demonstrated strong self-concept and a clear awareness of their individual strengths and skills. So they really knew who they were and what they were able to do and what sort of, also what kind of accommodations they needed. So these skills, such as problem solve that are outlined here, things like problem solving and goal setting and self-advocacy can be limited for an individual with TBI because of their functional limitations. So I'd like you to think about how you would work with individuals to teach and accommodate these skills that have been demonstrated to be that are characteristic of successful individuals with disabilities. And so I want you to think about how you would work with individuals to teach and accommodate these skills, especially concerning around their understanding of their own disability and their strengths and needs. So think about the ways in which you support individuals develop their own skills regarding problem solving, goal setting, time management, prioritization, effective relationships with peers, effective relationships with supervisors, ability to adapt to new and changing work environments, awareness of own disabilities, coping and advocacy skills, ability to persist in difficult situations, maintain a sense of personal control, and a clear self-concept. And so think about these skills also aren't those hard skills of being able to, remember things and they're not hard skills. These are more softer skills that are malleable, and they're things that we can work on and develop and support individuals. So what I'm thinking about accommodations, and so the next two slides are just going to be explicitly reviewing some accommodations. So when I'm thinking about effective accommodations for employees with traumatic brain injury, there's some ways to sort of assess the environment and assess the employment environment to figure out how we can provide reasonable and effective accommodations for employees and that are young adults with traumatic brain injury. So the first question to ask is, and sorry I put this at the bottom, do the employer and other personnel, especially anyone who has any managerial or supervisory roles, do they require any explicit training on traumatic brain injury? Sometimes that's the most important and key role that we have, right? Is we can give the skills and characteristics, and we can help individuals develop those. But if they're in a space where they're misunderstood, where they're facing that discrimination and or harassment, then all of our work and all of the hard work of the individual would be moot. So thinking about, does the employer and other personnel require training? What are explicit, what are those functional limitations that the individual is experiencing? Because that'll determine, obviously, the kinds of accommodations that will be useful to them. How do those functional limitations then affect their job performance? Because they could have a functional limitation that has no effect whatsoever, and so they might not even need an accommodation in that capacity. So thinking about and doing an explicit evaluation of the environment and the job performance and skills that are needed to be able to understand the relationship between the functional limitation and the accommodations. Which accommodations are available? They might work environment might already have several different accommodations available that you can choose from, and things that are easier to access because they are sort of already implemented in the workplace. That also means what's available, like what other ones have the individual with a traumatic brain injury, what have they been using that's been useful in different environments that we can apply to the work environment. So what has worked for the individual in the past? And the most important thing is that they are involved in the accommodation evaluation process, because it can't be successful if they're not heavily involved in the determination of that process. And finally, how do you assess if the accommodations are even effective? This should be an ongoing process. So I'm going to quickly review just some of the accommodations that have been demonstrated to be effective for people with traumatic brain injuries in a career development environment. But I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to get to the strategies about overcoming those social environmental barriers. So there's a variety of different accommodations that have been demonstrated to be beneficial for people with traumatic brain injury, specifically young adults and emerging adults in the development of these characteristics that we were talking about before. One is pretty easy, right? The physical accommodations. Can they access the physical environment? This could be things like, if they need help with mobility and ramps and elevators and door handles and things like that, depending on what their gross and fine motor skills are. This can also be, and it can also be like simplifying environments too, right? So removing any sort of unnecessary materials or distractions or things like that. So having a very simplified physical environment. The second list of accommodations are things that revolve around things like organizational accommodations. And that includes everything like how to create to-do lists, using calendars. For people who benefit from visualization and don't necessarily want to read text, rely on text, you can use things like images and color coding and timers, having additional reminders as well. And this could be through the use of technology and apps. Problem-solving accommodations, as we know, often a traumatic brain injury might interfere with the ability to engage in problem-solving skills. So having sort of visual representations, such as like diagrams and images of problem-solving techniques at their disposal, and making sure these aren't too text-heavy, so when they really need them the most, they're able to easily kind of go back and refer to those diagrams. And also having a direct resource, a manager or somebody where they can go to for questions and to help them through that process. Because if they don't know who to go to, often that can end up with them trying to do the problem solving independently without like all the useful information, and that might not be setting them up for success. Also, emotional accommodations to help regulate emotions and stress levels and anxiety levels. This can include things like praise and reinforcement, providing awareness as well, training for coworkers, and explicit stress management plans with visual cues for when they're sort of overwhelmed with a different sensory input. Included with that sensory input is the sensory accommodations. This could be everything from increasing, font in printed materials, changing out fluorescent lighting for things like natural lighting, full spectrum lighting, glare guards for sort of technology, and then even things like white noise machine or music, light music that can be used that soothes an individual or helps someone to focus, or things like noise canceling headphones. As we know, working memory can be a functional limitation for people with traumatic brain injury. So concerning accommodations that are focused around memory, things like allowing the individual in work environments to be able to do things like record meetings and trainings, and provided like written and visual representations of those meetings and trainings, keeping written instructions next to any sort of equipment or materials, so that way they don't necessarily need to remember exactly or explicitly how to use that. They can refer back to that. The next one is endurance accommodations, because often, the sort of stamina can be severely limited. So allowing things like flexible scheduling, breaks, increased time and repetition of training for new tasks, as well as allowing for things like self-paced workload. And this could also include like a self-paced, flexible scheduling, right? Maybe they work from home on days when necessary. Maybe it also means the ability or the break to be able to, call a service provider if they needed, a physician or a medical provider or a therapist or a counselor. So things like that would allow somebody to access those resources when necessary. And the last one are accommodations that focus on concentration. So things like dividing, large tasks and assignment into much more manageable, small, and explicitly explained tasks from that. And that also includes reducing those distractions. All right, so those are some of the accommodations that have been demonstrated to support and accommodate the functional limitations of people who experience a traumatic brain injury. That being said, I want to focus now most of our time and attention on those social and environmental strategies, moving beyond just the accommodations for the functional limitations. So the first strategy is the awareness of individual characteristics and skills and how to develop them. So really, this is, anybody who's done any strengths-based planning knows how successful and how positive thinking about what people can do well and what they can contribute into a work environment, into their own career trajectory can have on their career outcomes. And this means including and having accurate career assessments and not having that be stagnant, constantly reevaluating and figuring out, well, what skills have you gained? What strengths have you developed further? And so this can also include individual or group instruction that can help teach, different career adaptability skills, like those ones we were talking about before, the problem solving, self-advocacy, and communication skills. And this also includes accommodation advocacy, so working with individuals to advocate for their own accommodations, and also exploring other accommodations that might be useful and allow them to work and perform at the best of their abilities and to perform to their strengths. So the next strategy that I'd like to go through is broadening career explorations. So it's critical for all of us to engage in intentional exploration processes in order to introduce a variety of different options and help young adults, broaden their career goals, because they're not limited just by, what they're aware of. So career exploration can include acquiring information about personal strengths and interests, as well as understanding the vast array of options in the world of work. So strategies such as job shadows and site visits and online labor market surveys, all these things can really help us introduce an array of possible occupations. So this active and extensive career exploration process results in increasing career self-efficacy and a broader range of career options to be considered. The tools that we're going to explore at the end, the CAPT and the ECAM, those are ones that kind of focus on this strategy. So the next strategy is developing work opportunities. And that question brings us to, how can we begin to shape those initial employment outcomes for young adults with traumatic brain injury? First, whenever possible, youth with disabilities should participate in work-based instruction and community work experiences while they're still enrolled in high school. Early successful employment experiences consistently lead to future successful and gainful employment. Another key factor is to consider the job person fit. So individuals need access to employment that is both challenging and personally rewarding. A solid initial job match may be more time-consuming and challenging to pursue, like you might just want to match them in a job that they can do and that's available. However, over long term, individuals are more likely to maintain employment and ultimately be eligible for advancement opportunities if it's a good fit. We also need to look beyond service industry employment and consider placement into higher skilled positions. Some of these jobs will require specific occupational training or post-secondary coursework. Some positions utilize a variety of on-the-job training options. So employers may offer ongoing professional development or allow early career workers to learn those skills on the job, maybe supervised by a more experienced coworker. It is also possible to utilize financial incentives to increase access to initial employment. And those services can also include things like training, transportation, workplace accommodations. Yeah, I know things like ticket to work were like controversial and stuff like that, but they sometimes could be used to develop those work opportunities. Next strategy is obtaining post-secondary education and training, right? So we talked about a lot of the barriers that individuals face, but we know that we can assist them, individuals with traumatic brain injury, by providing initial information about a range of different options, right? So community colleges are often really underutilized when we think about like developing vocational skills. In addition to academic and workforce development programs, many community colleges offer things like short-term training programs that prepare individuals with skills needed to perform specific occupations, such as auto body repair, like vet tech assistance, wastewater treatment, stuff like that. These hands-on intensive training programs can provide an ideal learning environment for young adults with traumatic brain injury. University and four-year colleges programs also offer another venue as well to different dimensions of career development and advancement. So providing, initial information about a range of different options and helping them through that process with things like applications and financial aid. The other thing too is often students who transition from high school to post-secondary education don't connect with disability resources. And research has demonstrated that students who do and who are able to access accommodations through disability resources have more positive school belonging and success on a variety of different measures in post-secondary education. And finally, encouraging that positive communication and self-advocacy skills with young adults with traumatic brain injury can do wonders in post-secondary education settings. So the next strategy would be growing on the job. And that means, finding a job for placement is a significant accomplishment for a young adult with a traumatic brain injury, as well as the people who support them. But merely getting a job is not enough. The true challenge is to demonstrate the skills that are needed to maintain employment over time and be rewarded with promotions and raises and growth. So this establishment phase of career development, young adults need, maturity and mastery to succeed. So things like teaching problem solving, these skills that we talked about before, finding role models and mentors, peer support groups, external support systems, as well as those accommodations that we discussed, right? So that can include all the things we talked about, but modifying even things like the application, the features of the workplace, as well as shifting those workplace rules. And that includes figuring out the accommodations, the assistive technology that would be beneficial. So last is the idea of we can also change the workplace as well. And what this means is that, we're not just providing accommodations, but we are also supporting the employers and the other employees to create more equitable and accessible employment environments. So this means we can partner with employers to make the case for hiring people with disabilities. This could happen on a local level. It could happen on a much larger sort of, even on like a federal level. Working with human resources to do things like figure out what the accessibility standards are, developing budgets for accommodations, promoting recruitment efforts for people with disabilities and traumatic brain injury, as well as supporting employee mentoring programs. And so actually the ECAM that we're going to look at is an environmental evaluation of some of these strategies. So conducting employer trainings to increase disability awareness and address discrimination. And so this means not just for the employers, but also for the whole sort of workplace. These can be some of the most powerful sort of interventions to create equitable and accessible work environments that allow for young people to really establish career development and experience environments that are more accessible to career advancement. So I'd like to move. I know we have about 5 minutes left, and we might take up a little bit of the Q&A time, but I'd like to review 2 of the tools that came out of this research. Because what we were doing is we were thinking about these ideas. Okay, we know what the barriers are. Now we know what some of these strategies are. How can we help individuals and people who are helping them to allow for the career advancement for young adults with traumatic brain injury? So the first tool is called the CAPT. And the focus, the person that it's directed towards, is for a young adult. And this tool can be used either to sort of forward plan or to backward plan. And I'll show you what that means in a second. But the major purpose of the CAPT is to develop an understanding of the process of career development and to be used as like a way to gather information for the needs of career advancement. I'm going to exit out of the slide so I can show you the CAPT. Oh, that's the ECAM. Here we go. Can I make this big? Yeah, there we go. Oh. Oh, well, okay, we're just going to deal with seeing that. Okay, so the career advancement planning tool is used, you can use it along with, the young adult. And it's a way of sort of doing some career exploration and realizing that career advancement is a process, right? You're not just born, let's say you ask somebody, they want to, run a restaurant, they want to be a manager of a restaurant. You don't just, right off the bat, you graduate from high school, you apply for that. No, you work up to that. And so there's sort of steps that you take to get there. There's, a pre-employment position, which could be doing things like, even something like, doing work at home or having an internship or having a school-based. So maybe they're working at like a school, cafe or something like that. So then entry-level position, which would be that first position that an individual would take, and then moving on to the mid-level position. And then that long-term goal of what the individual has. And so this is sort of a way of thinking about, what is the career field that the individual is interested in, and what are the sort of career working environment? Like, is it something inside of a restaurant? Is it something that has a lot of noise and it's busy and people are on their feet and it's customer service oriented? So what are sort of the environmental factors that play into it? And so you can do this in a couple different ways. One, you could start with the long-term goal, fill it out, and maybe the student does like an informational interview and ask somebody, sits down with somebody who is a restaurant manager and says, okay, what was the first job that you had? What was the entry-level position, the mid-level position? How did you get to the place that you are today? And so you can kind of fill that out with that backwards planning. Or you can work with a student. Let's say a student has an internship at an environmental agency, let's just say. And so that internship you would put that under the pre-employment position. And then maybe you would have them talk with someone or do some research, online and find out, okay, so after this sort of internship, what are some opportunities for entry-level positions? And once I finish, an entry-level position and I've gained those skills, what would be the next position? And then what would be sort of the top position in that work environment? So it's a way for them to sort of like understand the steps taken. That's on the front page. And now what you're going to do is take the different positions that are in 1, 2, 3, and 4 on those different steps, and you're going to scroll down and enter them into the 1, 2, 3, and 4, this section that's at the top, the pre-employment position. So you'll write down the internship, the entry-level position, the mid-level, and then the long-term. And then they can do some exploration. So this tool is used for them to understand, okay, I think that I want to do these different jobs, but what are the duties of the position? What are the salary, the wages, the benefits? So what are some of the opportunities for financial advancement, right? What also then C, what are the types of training and post-secondary education opportunities? Are there mentorships at these various levels and these various positions? Will I need to go back to college? Will I need to go get a certificate of training? So basically explicitly exploring what are the training and post-secondary education opportunities. And then the last piece, and you might want to, you can even make this a little bit bigger and adapt it, is then what are the sort of barriers that the individual will face? And then what are the development strategies and accommodations that that individual can use to overcome and to accommodate those barriers in the workforce. So this is the CAPT, and it's a great way for young adults to think a little bit deeper and do some career exploration and figure out like what, and do some planning about what career exploration looks like, right? And not necessarily thinking of it as like an explicit plan, right? That's something that they have to do, but it's taking a look at how careers sort of develop over time. And it takes, you know, a variety of different supports and strategies to get from that pre-employment position to that long-term position. So this is the CAPT. Please take it, copy it, use it, change it, adapt it. Give me feedback, because this is something that we're still like sort of working on and trying to really to make better every day and to make more useful. And I love hearing about all the different ways that people have used this tool with people, and including themselves as well. So I would love any sort of feedback that anybody would have on this tool. The second tool is one that's also more, it's in development as well, but I still want to share with you because I think it can be very useful. This is, this tool is the ECAM, and it's the Environmental Career Advancement Measure. And it's more utilized like the professionals, right, who are supporting young adults with traumatic brain injury or with disabilities to assess the kind of career opportunities and employment environments. So when you're thinking about, you know, placement or like working with this individual with a traumatic brain injury and trying to figure out like an environment that would be accessible and equitable for them, it's a way to sort of assess it based upon like the research that we looked at. So, you know, there's some sort of like descriptive information to fill out, the work site, what field is it in, as well, you know, general information. And then there are these questions that ask about like the career advancement climate. And, you know, so does the work site have positions of various levels with various responsibilities, or does everybody sort of have the same low skill, low position? So thinking about what different kinds of opportunities are there for advancement. Explicitly thinking about what are the entry-level positions, what are the mid-level positions, and what are the more long-term positions. The next question saying, you know, when they're hiring somebody for a position, do they usually promote somebody from within, or do they look outside? And thinking about how that might affect a person, you know, with a disability. How often are promotions given? What's the process for getting a promotion? What are the supports and opportunities to available to learn new skills? And what are those availabilities? So these kinds of questions about things like raises and skill building are sort of a way of assessing the environmental capacity for career advancement within a job site. And so this is sort of a good evaluation to kind of figure out what kinds of opportunities are specifically available. Looking at diversity can be also a really key to see like how accommodating an environment really is. And also like how much representation is there of individuals with disabilities at all levels in the workplace. And so understanding sort of what disability resources are available, how much knowledge does the people in HR or the supervisors or the employers, how much do they know about reasonable accommodations? And then the number 21 might be a little bit more challenging, which is, you know, understanding if individuals with disabilities experience discrimination in this workplace. There's a couple ways of going about that question, but that's one too that's like, you know, it's important to like do a little bit of analysis with. So this measure is mostly utilized for understanding how workplaces and different employment environments can be either supportive or not supportive for individuals with traumatic brain injury and other disabilities when it comes to issues of career advancement. I think I went about 5 minutes over, so I think we have about 10 minutes for question and answer or comments. But again, with either of these tools or with anything, I really, really welcome your your feedback. I really appreciate engaging in these conversations, and I think we're all sort of in this process of career development and career advancement. So I thank everybody for joining me today, and yeah, I look forward to your questions.
So Laurie, we have one question so far that came up. It's from Jody. Hi, Jody. Jody says, where do you feel like disclosure comes into this conversation with self-advocacy and employment? How do you usually advise people on this?
Great question. So with disclosure, I think there's sort of two elements to it, right? There is sort of like the legal responsibilities of disclosure, or not, or the protection that we don't have to. So people with disabilities and traumatic brain injury do not have to disclose or sort of disclose their disability prior to being hired. So they have to be offered like the position before they even need to sort of disclose. But there are certain questions too, and there's certain ways of evaluating environments too to see if disclosure is something that is sort of like welcomed or not welcomed. Because as we know, there's that second element of disclosure, which isn't necessarily the legal dimension or the sort of protocol, but it's sort of like the more social acceptance. And do you think that you'll be discriminated against either explicitly or implicitly after disclosure? So I think that disclosure comes into the process, not necessarily with a job achievement, but it comes in like once somebody has gotten a job and they are requesting reasonable accommodations, that's when they have every right to be able to do it. But I think that by sort of looking at these other strategies that think about like the social and environmental influence on career advancement, by doing so, by saying, like by advocating in a positive manner and by saying, I will be able to perform these tasks, but I just need these reasonable accommodations, having that knowledge can really put that disclosure process into a positive light and end up being much more productive in the acquiring of said accommodations. So that's a really complicated question, and I think, and I love it, Jody, I absolutely love it. I think that disclosure and employment and career development could be a whole other like 1 hour or a full day training as well. There's so much that goes into it that I think it's much more complex than I can kind of get to here. But I think disclosure is sort of linked with the idea of self-advocacy in this idea of career advancement.
So Emily is asking if we'll email attendees copies of the tools and slides. I believe Amanda sent both of those things out already, so they should be in your email.
I did adjust my slides in between when I sent them yesterday and then today, because I'm always sort of like updating things. So I can also send you, Melissa and Amanda, the updated slides as well.
Okay.
But
we can
absolutely
send that out.
Absolutely, those are the two tools that I would love to share. And if you use them in any capacity, I would love your, really honest and explicit feedback. Like what worked, what didn't work, what can we change to make it more useful? And what can we use, and what are the different ways in which you use it? So I would love if you would, be able to. So is this? Okay. Oh, I don't know. The last question.
Yeah, sending things out. You guys can share out anything you want. Allie is asking if this is approved through ASHA. In Oregon, it will be approved by the Oregon Speech and Hearing Board. We don't do ASHA approval because it's super, super expensive. So no, it's not nationally ASHA approved. And then, let's see, Faith just asked a question. Can you see that, Laurie?
Faith's question?
Yeah.
Yes. As an employment specialist, I work with folks who have developmental disabilities, autism, brain injury. I've also been married to a man with a brain injury for 35 years and facilitate support groups and social activities for people with brain injuries. With this experience, I still find working with adults with brain injury the most challenging. Yeah. I know this presentation is about youth and young adults, but I would love your ideas about supporting people in recovering their current abilities. Yeah, again, that is an incredible question, Faith. And it's absolutely been, the earlier on that you have a brain injury, I don't want to say the easiest because I don't want to make it seem like the things that our, youth and young adults are going through is easy, but it's a different set of barriers, and it's a different way about thinking about career development. Mostly because they're entering into the field already having the, having acquired a disability, as opposed to adults who might, have a full and successful career, acquire a disability, and then, like you said, like rediscovering current abilities. That's a whole other set and a whole other process that would be, it would be a great presentation and a conversation to have, but it is definitely one that's much more, it is a different set of, there's certain things like the list of accommodations and utilizing like career exploration and things like that you can do with adults for sure. But a lot of that is also like redefining, their sense of self and their sense of identity and who they are as an employee, right? And as a worker and as a professional. So that's a whole other conversation to have, but I think, it's one that is crucial, Faith. So I really thank you for bringing that up. So as far as like my recommendations for supporting people in sort of rediscovering their current abilities after brain injury, there are certain strategies, right, that could be utilized from this webinar that would still be really useful. Things like providing accommodations and career exploration. But like I said, there's also other elements that really play into this. So yeah, great question. Helen says, although I work with early intervention, birth to 5, I'm noticing more young parents with disabilities, and I truly appreciate this information and will explore it and share with families, coworkers, and other specialists. Oh, thank you very much, Helen. No question, but just I appreciate too that your perspective that yes, this is really useful for this kind of conversation is very useful for working, with young adults with disabilities, but that it also is useful like in other capacities as well, including we often forget the difficulty or the challenges, right, of working with parents with disabilities and what their rights are as well. And also I say challenges, but there's also a lot of joys and strengths that come with working with parents with disabilities too. Thank you for that comment, Helen.
Yes, thanks, Helen. So I think that's it, Laurie. We don't have any other questions, and we are right at 11 o'clock. So I am going to say goodbye to everyone and end the recording now. So thank you, everyone, for getting on, and we look forward to seeing you next month at our next webinar, which is April 19th.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Yeah.